That night, he wasn't a mafia boss. He was just a man. With a woman he loved, everything was perfect. The rain against the tall windows, the city lights blurred by fog, the silence. She had finally chosen him. She had finally said yes, but when his fingers traced her back, beneath the silk, beneath the lace, he felt something that wasn't skin, scars, burns, finger-shaped bruises, and with a voice that made empires tremble, he said only 5 words. "Who did this to you?" San Francisco had never felt colder. The fog rolled in from the bay like something alive, thick and silver, pressing itself against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse on the 32nd floor of a building that had no name on any public registry. The rain had started around 9. By midnight it was steady, not violent, not dramatic, just relentless. The kind of rain that made you forget what sunlight felt like. Inside the penthouse was warm, not the artificial warmth of central heating, but the warmth of dark wood, amber light, and silence. A fire crackled low in a stone fireplace that took up most of the southern wall. The furniture was minimal, a long sectional in charcoal velvet, a glass table with nothing on it, bookshelves lined with volumes that had actually been read. And the air smelled faintly of cedar and something darker. Whiskey, maybe, or just the kind of quiet that comes from being very far above the world. A clock ticked somewhere. It was the only sound. Lawrence Augustine stood by the window, looking at nothing and everything. His reflection stared back at him. Tall, lean, jaw cut sharp enough to leave a mark. His shirt was untucked, the top 3 buttons undone. A glass of Macallan sat on the windowsill beside him, barely touched. His dark hair, usually combed with military precision, fell slightly over his forehead. He looked for the first time in months, almost human. At 34, Lawrence Augustine was many things to many people. To the businessmen who sat across from him in boardrooms, he was a venture capitalist with an uncanny ability to pick winners. And to the politicians who accepted his quiet donations, he was a philanthropist of selective generosity. To the families who controlled the ports, the unions, the construction corridors that veined through the Northern California coast, he was something else entirely. He was the man you didn't cross. He wasn't loud about it. That was the thing. Some men in his position needed the theater, the entourage, the heavy rings, the threats delivered in dim restaurants over expensive wine. Lawrence didn't. He sat in rooms and said very little, and when he left, things had changed permanently. His danger wasn't a performance. It was architecture, invisible until you were already inside it, and by then, the doors had closed. But tonight, he wasn't any of those things. Tonight, he was just a man, standing at a window, thinking about the woman in the other room. Her name was Bonnie Shaw. She had come into his life 7 months ago, and he still hadn't figured out how. That was unusual. Lawrence tracked everything, every dollar, every contact, every entry and exit in his world. But Bonnie hadn't entered through any of the usual doors. She wasn't a society introduction. She wasn't a deal attached to a handshake. She was the new executive assistant to Meridian Caulfield, his attorney, and Lawrence had walked into a meeting, expecting contract revisions, and instead found a woman with copper-brown eyes sitting behind a desk too large for her, organizing files with a quiet efficiency that made his chest do something unfamiliar. She was 24, slender. Her hair was dark, almost black, and she wore it pulled back in a way that made her neck look impossibly long. She dressed in muted colors, always long sleeves, always high collars, even when the office was warm. She didn't wear jewelry, except for a thin, silver chain with no pendant. She smelled like white tea and clean cotton. He'd asked her to dinner on the 3rd meeting. She'd said no. He'd asked again on the 5th. She'd said no again, but slower. By the 7th, she'd said, "Only if we go somewhere, no one will see us." He'd taken her to a small Thai restaurant in the Sunset District where the owner didn't speak English and the tables were in the back behind a curtain of wooden beads. They'd talked for 3 hours. She told him she was from Nevada, a town she called the kind of place people leave. She'd put herself through college working nights. As she read Dostoevsky for fun. She laughed rarely, but when she did, it transformed her entire face into something so open it almost hurt to look at. She never asked him what he did. Not really. When he mentioned business, she nodded without curiosity, without hunger. She didn't ask about the penthouse, the car, the silent men who sometimes stood near doors when he entered buildings. She didn't ask for anything. And that was the thing that broke him. Because in Lawrence's world, everyone asked for something. Everyone had a price, a leverage point, an angle. But Bonnie sat across from him with her hands wrapped around a cup of jasmine tea and wanted absolutely nothing from him except his attention. For a man who controlled empires, that was the most dangerous thing he'd ever encountered. 7 months later, she was in his penthouse. Not for the first time. She'd been here a dozen times before. They'd had dinners, watched films. He'd read aloud to her once while she lay on the couch with her eyes closed, and it was the most intimate thing he'd experienced in his adult life. But their physical relationship had progressed slowly. Not because of him. Because of her. She would lean into his touch, then pull away. She'd let him kiss her, deep and lingering, then place her hand flat on his chest, as if measuring the distance she needed. She'd stay the night but sleep in a separate room, and Lawrence, who had never in his life waited for anything, waited, because something in her hesitation wasn't reluctance, it was fear, and he could feel the difference. But tonight felt different. She'd arrived at 8 with her hair down, the first time he'd ever seen it loose. It fell past her shoulders in dark waves. She wore a dress he hadn't seen before, deep burgundy, silk, with a neckline that dipped just below her collarbone. She'd brought a bottle of wine she couldn't afford, and when he'd opened the door, she'd kissed him first, not carefully, not cautiously, but like someone who had made a decision. They'd eaten, talked. The conversation had wound down into something quieter, something with weight. She'd moved closer to him on the couch. His hand had found the curve of her waist. She'd leaned her head against his shoulder, and he'd felt her breathing change, slower, deliberate, as if she was steadying herself. "Stay tonight," he'd said. Not a question, but not a command either. An opening. She'd looked up at him, and in those copper-brown eyes, he saw it. The war, the wanting and the terror, embraided together so tightly they were indistinguishable. "Yes," she'd whispered. "Yes, I'll stay." The bedroom was at the end of a hallway lined with nothing. No art, no photographs, just dark walls and low light. The bed was large, dressed in slate-gray linen. The city lights filtered through sheer curtains, casting everything in a pale, shifting glow. Lawrence kissed her in the doorway, Wasim, slowly. His hands cradled her face, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. She kissed him back with a hunger that surprised them both, her fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt. He guided her gently to the edge of the bed. She sat. He knelt to remove her shoes, one, then the other, placing them neatly aside. She smiled at that, a small, trembling thing, and he looked up at her from the floor. "Oh, we don't have to do anything you don't want," he said. I want to," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands weren't. He stood. She reached for the hem of his shirt and pulled it over his head, and he let her, watching her face as her eyes traveled over him. Then it was his turn. He reached for the thin strap of her dress, sliding it gently off her shoulder. She closed her eyes. The silk whispered as it fell. Beneath it, she wore a camisole of ivory lace. Simple. Elegant. He traced his fingers along her back, feeling the warmth of her skin through the fabric. His hand moved to the clasp at the nape of her neck. Then his fingers stopped. Not because of hesitation. Because beneath the lace, against the ridge of her shoulder blade, he felt something that wasn't skin. It was raised, textured. A line, no multiple lines running parallel, slightly curved, in like marks left by something thin and deliberate. His hand went still. Bonnie's entire body went rigid. In the pale light of the city, with the rain still tapping against the glass, Lawrence Augustin, a man who had ordered the dismantling of rival operations, who had sat unmoved while men begged, felt something crack inside his chest. He moved his hand lower. Gently. As gently as he had ever done anything. Along the curve of her ribs, where the lace ended, he felt more, a patch of skin that was too smooth, scar tissue from a burn. Further down, near her hip, the unmistakable impression of fingers, not a grip, a bruise pattern, old, but deep enough to have left its ghost behind. Bonnie didn't move. She sat perfectly still, her eyes still closed, her breathing stopped entirely, like a deer that had heard the crack of a branch, and like a woman who had spent years learning that stillness was the only protection. Lawrence stepped back. He looked at her. Really looked. And now he saw what he had missed, or what she had been brilliant at hiding. The long sleeves in every season, the high collars, the way she flinched almost imperceptibly whenever someone raised a hand too fast, even just to wave. The way she always positioned herself, near exits. The way she held her body, not with shyness, but with the disciplined posture of someone who had learned that making yourself small could save your life. His jaw locked. Something behind his eyes went very, very cold. "Who did this to you?" His voice was quiet. Not soft, quiet. The kind of quiet that precedes earthquakes. And the kind of quiet that men who knew him would recognize as the most dangerous sound Lawrence Augustin could make. Bonnie opened her eyes. And the look on her face told him everything. Not surprise, not confusion, resignation. Like she'd been waiting 7 months for this exact moment. The moment he would find out. The moment everything would end. "Please," she whispered. "Please don't look at me like that." She reached for the silk dress pooled at her waist and tried to pull it up, tried to cover herself, but her hands were shaking so badly the fabric slipped through her fingers. Lawrence didn't help her. He didn't reach out. He didn't touch her. He understood in that instant that touch was the last thing she needed from him right now. Instead, he walked to the chair by the window. He picked up the cashmere throw, draped over its arm, and held it out to her. Not close enough to crowd her, just close enough that she could take it when she was ready. She looked at the blanket, then at him. Then she took it and wrapped it around herself like armor, pulling it tight under her chin, and Lawrence watched a woman he thought he'd been getting to know for 7 months become someone else entirely. Someone older, someone smaller, someone who had been here before. Not in this room, but in this moment. The moment after someone sees. He sat on the edge of the bed, not beside her, across from her, giving her space, giving her air. "Talk to me," he said. "It's nothing. Bonnie, it's old. It doesn't matter." "Those marks on your ribs are not old," he said. "Those are weeks, maybe a month. I've seen enough to know the difference." She looked at him then, really looked, and he saw the exact moment the wall began to crack. Her eyes filled but didn't spill over. She bit the inside of her lips so hard he saw the muscle in her jaw flex. "You weren't supposed to see," she said. "No one was ever supposed to see." "Who?" Silence. "Bonnie." "Who?" She closed her eyes. When she opened them again, something had shifted. The resignation became something harder, something that looked almost like defiance. The kind that comes not from strength, but from having nothing left to protect. "His name is Cresswell Aldridge," she said. The name landed in the room like a stone in still water. Lawrence knew it. Not personally, but he knew the architecture around it. The Aldridge family was old money. Real estate. Political fundraising. In Cresswell's father, Everard Aldridge, sat on the boards of 3 hospitals and had been photographed shaking hands with the last 2 governors. The family donated to children's charities. They funded literacy programs. Their name was on a wing of the public library downtown. And their son was a monster. We were together for 2 years, Bonnie said. Her voice had gone flat, clinical, almost. The voice of someone telling a story they'd rehearsed in their head 1,000 times, stripping it of everything that might make them feel it again. I met him through a temp agency. I was placed at his father's firm as a filing clerk. Cresswell ran the property development division. He was charming, attentive, the kind of man who remembers what you ordered the first time and orders it for you the second. I thought it was romantic. She paused. I pulled the blanket tighter. It started small. Comments about what I wore, who I talked to, how long I took to answer his calls. Then it got organized. He started checking my phone, showing up at my apartment without calling. He convinced me to move in with him because he said it was safer. Then the locks changed, and I didn't get a key. Lawrence's hands were resting on his knees. To anyone watching, he looked calm. But Bonnie had spent years reading body language the way a sailor reads weather, and she could see it. The stillness in his shoulders, the controlled breathing, the way his fingers had gone white at the knuckles. The first time he hit me, she said, he cried after, told me he was stressed, that his father put too much pressure on him, that I was the only good thing in his life, and he was terrified of losing me. I believed him, because I needed to. She looked at the window, at the rain, at anything that wasn't Lawrence's face. The second time he didn't cry. The third time, he didn't even apologize. By the 10th, I'd stopped counting. The burns came when he was drunk. The marks on my back. She stopped, swallowed. Those were from a belt. His belt. He liked to say it was discipline. That I needed to learn. Lawrence said nothing. She continued. Not because he asked, but because once the wall cracks, the flood doesn't stop for permission. I tried to leave, twice. The first time he found me at a motel off Highway 1. He'd tracked my phone. He brought me back, and he was very calm about it. Said if I tried again, he'd tell immigration about my mother. She's documented now, but she wasn't always, and he had records. He said one phone call and she'd be detained. The second time I made it to a shelter. I was there for 4 days. On the 5th day, the shelter received an anonymous donation of $50,000. The next day, the director told me she was sorry, but they couldn't accommodate me anymore. Cresswell didn't need to threaten with fists. He threatened with systems. How did you get out? Lawrence asked. His voice was level, perfectly controlled. But there was something underneath it now, something tectonic. He got bored, she said. Simple as that. He started seeing someone else. A state senator's daughter, younger, shinier. He threw me out like old furniture, told me if I ever said a word, he'd destroy me. Not hurt me, destroy me, my career, my mother's status, my credit, my name. He said nobody would believe a temp clerk over in Aldridge. She looked at Lawrence, and he was right. Nobody would. The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Then Lawrence asked the question she dreaded most. Why didn't you tell me? Her face crumpled, not dramatically, quietly. The kind of breaking that happens in the muscles around the eyes, in the tightening of the throat, in the small tremor of the chin that betrays everything a person is trying to hold together. Because, she said, and her voice broke on the word, because I didn't want you to look at me and see someone weak. Someone damaged. I didn't want to be the woman you had to rescue. I wanted to be the woman you chose. Lawrence closed his eyes. In his life, he had heard confessions. He had heard men bargain for their freedom, their businesses, their families. He had heard lies so elaborate they deserved admiration. He had heard truth used as a weapon and silence used as a shield. But he had never heard anything that cut as deep as Bonnie Shaw sitting in his bedroom, wrapped in a blanket, telling him that the reason she hid her scars wasn't shame. It was love. She hadn't told him because she didn't want to be less in his eyes. And that devastated him more than anything Cresswell Aldridge had ever done. There is a moment, if you've never seen it, consider yourself fortunate, when a very dangerous man decides exactly what he is going to do. It is not the moment of rage. Rage is loud and temporary and burns itself out. This is something else. This is the moment when the fire stops flickering and becomes structural. When it stops being a reaction and becomes a plan. Lawrence Augustine opened his eyes. He looked at Bonnie. She was bracing for it. He could see it in her posture. She was waiting for the explosion, the questions, the anger, the pity. She was waiting for him to become another man who made her feel small. Instead, he did something she did not expect. He stood, walked to her, and knelt. Not knelt the way men kneel in movies. Quickly, dramatically, one knee down and back up. He knelt the way you kneel in churches, both knees, slowly, until he was looking up at her from the floor, his hands resting palms up on his thighs, his face level with hers. She stared at him, confused, afraid. He reached up, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and placed his hand against her cheek. His thumb wiped a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "Listen to me," he said. "Thought you are not damaged." She shook her head. "Lawrence, you are not shameful. You don't understand. You are not what he did to you, and you are not alone anymore." She broke, not the controlled, careful kind of breaking she'd perfected over years. This was the other kind. The kind that comes when someone says the exact words you've been waiting your whole life to hear, and you realize you'd stop believing anyone ever would. She wept. Not silently. Not elegantly. She wept the way children weep. Openly, with her whole body, her shoulders shaking, her hands covering her face. She wept for the girl who'd walked into a temp agency with a pressed blouse and a borrowed smile. She wept for the woman who'd slept on a motel floor with ice on her ribs. She wept for every long sleeve in summer, every excuse about a clumsy accident. Every smile that cost her everything to produce. And Lawrence held her. He wrapped his arms around her and pulled her against his chest, and he held her the way you hold something that is not broken, but is finally setting itself back together. He didn't speak. He didn't tell her it was okay because it wasn't okay. He didn't tell her it would be fine because fine was a word people used when they didn't want to engage with the truth. He just held her, and in that holding, something shifted, not between them, within her. For the first time in Bonnie Shaw's life, she was being held by a man who had the power to hurt anyone, and he was choosing, actively, deliberately, with every fiber of his controlled and calculated being, to be gentle. And that gentleness did what no amount of violence ever could. It made her believe she deserved it. They sat like that for a long time. The rain continued. The clock ticked. The city lights moved through the curtains like slow-motion waves. Eventually, her breathing steadied. She pulled back slightly, wiping her face with the edge of the blanket, and looked at him with red-rimmed eyes that held something new. Not hope, not yet, but the space where hope might grow if given enough light. "What are you going to do?" she asked. He looked at her, studied her, and she watched him choose his next words with the precision of a man disarming a bomb. "Nothing you don't want me to do." "Lawrence, I mean it. This is yours, your story, your decision. I will do nothing without your knowledge. But I need you to understand something." He stood, walked to the window. The city below was a grid of wet light. And he looked at it the way a general looks at a map. "I am not a good man," he said. "I've never pretended to be. The things I've done to build what I have, they would keep most people awake at night. They don't keep me awake. I made peace with what I am a long time ago." He turned back to her. "But there are rules. Even in my world, there are rules. And the first one, the one that everything else stands on, is that you do not hurt someone who cannot fight back. You do not use power to break people. You do not take a person's safety and twist it into a weapon." His voice was still quiet, still controlled, but beneath the control, something was moving, something old and patient and absolutely certain. Cresswell Aldridge broke that rule, and I want you to know, not as a threat, not as a promise, but as a fact, that men who break that rule in my proximity Do not continue to operate comfortably. Bonnie looked at him for a long time, and then she asked the question that would change everything. Will you hurt him? Lawrence considered this, genuinely considered it. No, he said. I'll do something worse. I'll make him irrelevant. The next morning, Bonnie woke alone in the slate-gray bed, wrapped in linen and the cashmere throw. Sunlight came through the curtains in thin gold lines. The rain had stopped. The penthouse was quiet. On the nightstand, a single note in Lawrence's precise handwriting. Coffee is in the kitchen. Ostara will bring you anything you need. I'll be back by noon. Ixuel Ostara. Venet was Lawrence's head of household, a tall Eritrean woman in her 50s with eyes that missed nothing and a demeanor that suggested she had seen everything and judged very little of it. She brought Bonnie a tray with a French press, a croissant, sliced pear, and a small vase with a single white freesia. She said nothing about the night before. She said nothing about why Bonnie was here. She simply placed the tray on the bedside table and said, Mr. Augustin asks that you stay as long as you like, and left. Bonnie stayed, not because she was told to, but because for the first time in years, staying somewhere felt safe. Lawrence did not go to work that morning. He went to the 28th floor of a different building, one registered under a holding company called Aurelius Partners, and which was itself owned by a trust that traced back through 4 jurisdictions to a post office box in Liechtenstein. The office was spare, a desk, 3 monitors, a secure phone, and Cassius Thorne. Cassius was Lawrence's head of intelligence, a word that, in their world, meant something very specific. He was 41, former military intelligence, dishonorably discharged for reasons no one discussed, with a mind that operated like a search engine designed by someone without ethics. He could find anything about anyone, and he had a particular talent for finding the things people had spent fortunes to bury. Cresswell Aldridge, Lawrence said, sitting down. Cassius didn't ask why. He never did. He pulled up a chair, opened a laptop, and said, Timeline? Comprehensive, personal, financial, political. I want to know every account. Every property, every deal, every indiscretion. I want to know who he's afraid of and who's afraid of him. I want to know where his money comes from and where it goes. I want to know his habits, his addictions, his patterns. He paused, and I want to know if she's the only one. Cassius looked at him for a moment. Something passed between them, not a question, but an understanding. How fast? As fast as Thorough allows. Cassius delivered the first report within 72 hours. Cresswell Aldridge was 31, Harvard Business School, graduated with a gentleman's C average and his father's connections. He ran the property development arm of Aldridge and Associates, but ran was generous. The actual operations were managed by a woman named Thessaly Beek, a sharp, overworked CFO who kept the division profitable while Cresswell played golf and attended ribbon cuttings. His personal finances were a labyrinth, trust funds layered over trusts, properties in his name, his mother's name, his ex-girlfriend's name, a yacht in Sausalito registered to a shell company, credit card statements that read like a tour of every high-end establishment in the Bay Area, restaurants, clubs, hotels, a recurring charge at a private establishment in Nob Hill that Cassius flagged with a single word. Interesting. But the financial picture was just the frame. The portrait inside was darker. Bonnie was not the only one. Cassius had found 3 other women. One was a former intern at the Aldridge firm who had left abruptly and moved to Portland. Another was a bartender at a lounge Cresswell frequented. Itty, who had filed a police report that was later withdrawn. The officer's notes indicated the complainant had been persuaded to reconsider. The third was the most recent. Seraphine Lowry, the state senator's daughter Bonnie had mentioned. 22 years old. Instagram presence. Designer clothes. And in photos Cassius had obtained through channels Lawrence didn't ask about. A bruise on her upper arm that she'd covered with foundation, but not well enough. Lawrence read the report in silence. Then he read it again. Then he set it down and stared at the wall for a long time. "There's more," Cassius said. "Tell me." "The Property Development Division. It's not just underperforming, it's dirty. Cresswell has been skimming from renovation contracts for years. Inflated bids, phantom subcontractors, materials that never arrived. Thessaly Beak has been covering for him, not because she's complicit, but because if the division collapses, 200 people lose their jobs, and she's the one who gets blamed." "How much?" "Conservative estimate? 4.2 million over 6 years. And his father?" "Everard either doesn't know or doesn't want to know. He's insulated himself with enough layers of deniability that it would take a forensic accountant 6 months to untangle it. But the exposure is real. If this comes out, the Aldridge name doesn't just take a hit. It craters." Lawrence picked up the report again. Looked at it the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray. "Contact Thessaly Beak," he said. "Quietly, offer her a position at Meridian Holdings. Better salary, full authority, no Aldridge oversight. Make sure she understands that the offer is genuine and that her cooperation with any future inquiries would be appreciated, but not required. And the women. Protection first. Resources second. If any of them want to speak, they'll have legal representation at my expense. If they don't, they'll never hear from us again. No pressure, no leverage, their choice." Cassius nodded. "And Cresswell?" Lawrence stood, buttoned his jacket, walked to the door. "Cresswell comes last, when everything else is already in place." Over the next 6 weeks, Cresswell Aldridge's world began to shift beneath his feet. It started small. A deal he'd been negotiating with a development firm in the financial district fell through unexpectedly. The principal cited market conditions, but the market hadn't changed. And then a property in the marina he'd been trying to acquire was sold out from under him to an anonymous buyer who outbid him by 12%. He made calls. Nobody returned them. His bank called about irregularities in 2 of his accounts. A compliance review, they said. Routine, except it wasn't routine, because it had never happened before, and the compliance officer, asking the questions, seemed to know exactly which threads to pull. Then, the social circle thinned. His membership at the Pacific Union Club was not renewed. An administrative oversight, they said, though the Pacific Union hadn't had an administrative oversight since 1889. An invitation to a charity gala hosted by the mayor's wife was mysteriously lost. A golf partner of 15 years suddenly had scheduling conflicts every weekend. Cresswell told himself it was coincidence. Then the journalist called. Her name was Eulalia Moncrief, and she worked for a digital investigative outlet that had made its reputation breaking stories about corporate malfeasance. She called Cresswell's office and asked for a comment on allegations of financial irregularities within the Property Development Division of Aldridge and Associates. She mentioned specific numbers, specific contracts, specific subcontractors who didn't exist. Cresswell hung up. Then he called his father. Everard Aldridge did not take the call. The walls were closing in, and Cresswell could feel it but couldn't see it. That was the genius of what Lawrence had built. There was no single point of attack, no obvious adversary. It was erosion, systematic, multi-directional, and impossibly patient. Every element appeared independent. The bank, the journalist, the social exclusion, the lost deals, they all seemed like separate strokes of bad luck. But bad luck doesn't have architecture, and this had architecture. Cresswell started drinking more. His temper shortened. Seraphine Lowry posted a photo from a spa in Napa, alone, and didn't answer his texts for 3 days. When she finally did, it was a single sentence. "I think we should take a break." He threw his phone through a window. But the worst part, the part that kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling of his overpriced loft, was the silence. No one was threatening him. No one was confronting him. No one was telling him what was happening or why. It was as if the universe itself had decided, quietly and without announcement, and that Cresswell Aldridge was no longer welcome in it. He started looking over his shoulder, checking his car before he got in, avoiding windows. He was, for the first time in his life, afraid, and he didn't even know of what. The warehouse was in Hunter's Point, on a street that hadn't seen maintenance since the shipyard closed. It was the kind of building that looked abandoned, but wasn't, a distinction that mattered only to the people who used it and the people who were brought to it. Cresswell arrived in the back of a black sedan that he didn't remember getting into. The sequence of events that led him here was blurred. A phone call from someone claiming to represent an investor interested in salvaging his development deals, a meeting location that seemed odd but not alarming, and then a door that locked behind him. Two men he'd never seen before guided him down a corridor and into a room that was empty, except for a metal chair, a desk, and a lamp that cast more shadows than light. He sat because standing felt worse. For 20 minutes, nothing happened, just silence and the distant sound of the bay. Then a door opened, and Lawrence Augustine stepped out of the dark. He wore a dark suit, no tie, his hands in his pockets. He looked to Cresswell like a man who had just come from a dinner party and had stopped here on his way home. Unhurried, composed, as if this room and this moment were minor entries in a very long evening. Cresswell didn't recognize him, not at first. Then something clicked, a face from a fundraiser maybe, or a photograph in a business magazine. And then the recognition deepened, and Cresswell's skin went cold. "You're—" "Yes," Lawrence said. As if Cresswell had stated the weather, he pulled the other chair from behind the desk and sat across from Cresswell, close enough to converse, far enough to observe. He crossed one leg over the other. His shoes were polished. His expression was nothing. "I'm going to tell you a story," Lawrence said. "And then I'm going to give you a choice. I'd recommend listening carefully to both." Cresswell said nothing. His mouth had gone dry. "There was a woman," Lawrence began. "Intelligent, hard-working, quiet. She came from nothing and built herself into something, and she did it without help, without shortcuts, without the kind of safety net that people like you are born standing on. She walked into your father's firm, looking for a job. And you looked at her and saw something you could own." Cresswell's jaw tightened. "You spent 2 years breaking her, methodically, patiently. You hit her when you were angry, and you hit her when you were bored. You burned her when you were drunk. You used a belt because you liked the control it gave you. And when she tried to leave, you didn't just stop her. You destroyed the only escape routes she had. You threatened her family. You bought off a shelter. You made her believe that no one would ever listen because the world had taught you that your name could make anything disappear." Lawrence leaned forward, just slightly, just enough. "You mistook her silence for weakness." The room was very still. "She was not weak," Lawrence said. "She was surviving. There's a difference so vast that men like you will never comprehend it. She carried what you did to her without breaking, without losing herself, without becoming what you tried to make her. And then she walked away from you and built a life. And she did it in silence because she believed, because you taught her to believe, that her silence was the only power she had." He paused, let the words settle. "She was wrong about that, and so were you." Cresswell's composure, what remained of it, cracked. "Whatever she told you," he started. "Don't." One word, quiet as a closing door, and Cresswell stopped. "Here is what is going to happen," Lawrence said, and his tone shifted from narrative to fact, from story to architecture. Eulalia Moncrief will publish her article in 72 hours. The financial irregularities in your development division will become public record. Of $4.2 million in fraud, meticulously documented. Your father will be forced to issue a statement. The board will remove you. The SEC will open an investigation that they have, in fact, already been briefed on." Cresswell's face lost its color. Simultaneously, 3 women you assumed would never speak, will file statements with the district attorney's office. Not because they were coerced, because they were asked for the first time if they wanted to. And they did. They have legal representation. They have protection. They have each other. and they have documentation you didn't know existed, because you never imagined that the people you hurt would ever be in a position to matter. He stood. Now, the choice. He walked to the desk and placed a folder on it. Manila. Thin. Option 1. You leave, quietly. You resign from the family firm, citing personal reasons. You divest your assets, the yacht, the properties, the club memberships, all of it, into a trust that will be administered for the benefit of the women you harmed. You leave San Francisco. You do not return. You do not contact any of them, ever. The criminal proceedings will continue regardless, but your cooperation will be noted. Option 2. You stay. You fight. You hire lawyers and play the victim and try to bury this the way your family has buried everything. And I will make it my personal project, not my business, not my obligation, but my project, to ensure that every person in your life understands exactly who you are, not through violence, through truth, the kind of truth that no amount of money can unspeak. He looked at Cresswell. I'd recommend option 1. But then, I've never been particularly good at recommendations. Cresswell stared at the folder. His hands were trembling. His eyes were wet. Not from remorse, but from the specific terror of a man who has spent his entire life believing he was untouchable and has just discovered in a warehouse in Hunter's Point at 11 o'clock at night that he is not. Who are you to her? Cresswell whispered. Lawrence looked at him for a long moment. Someone who sees her, he said. Which is more than you ever did. He turned and walked to the door. The car will take you home, he said without looking back. You have 72 hours. The door closed. Cresswell sat alone in the silence, in the shadows, in the ruins of a life that had been dismantled around him with the precision of a watch, taken apart by a man who understood every gear. 48 hours later, he chose option 1. 3 months later, the penthouse, the same room, the same windows, the same view of a city wrapped in fog. But everything was different. The cold had broken. It was early spring, and the light that came through the curtains was softer now, golden, not silver. The fireplace was unlit. The room smelled like coffee and fresh linen, and the faint, particular sweetness of freesias, which Ostara had been placing in every room since Bonnie first mentioned she liked them. Bonnie stood by the window in a t-shirt and bare feet, her hair down, a mug of coffee in both hands. She looked out at the bay, at the bridge emerging from the fog like something half-remembered, and she breathed. Just breathed. It was the kind of breathing that people who have been held underwater for a very long time do when they finally break the surface. Not gasping, not desperate, slow, deep, the kind of breath that says, I am here, I am alive, I am not going back under. The article had run in January. Eulalia Moncrief's piece was meticulous, 12,000 words that dismantled the financial scaffolding of Cresswell Aldridge's career with the clinical efficiency of a demolition team that had studied the blueprints. The public reaction was predictable. Outrage followed by more outrage, followed by the particular kind of outrage that comes when people realize they shook hands with someone who belonged in handcuffs. Everard Aldridge issued a statement expressing shock and disappointment at his son's actions, in which was the wealthy family's equivalent of a public disownment. The board removed Cresswell within a week. The SEC investigation moved forward, and in a quieter, less public proceeding, 3 women sat in a room with a district attorney and told their stories. Bonnie was one of them. It was the hardest thing she'd ever done. Harder than leaving. Harder than the shelter. Harder than the nights when she'd lain awake, wondering if her silence was protecting her or imprisoning her. She sat in a chair across from people she'd never met and said out loud, in full sentences, what had been done to her body and her spirit, and she did not minimize it. She did not apologize for it. She did not cry, though she wanted to, because she had decided, somewhere between that night in the penthouse and this morning in the DA's office, that the time for crying was over. She spoke with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the truth so many times it no longer had teeth. And when she was finished, The attorney, a woman named Cordelia Fenchurch who had spent 20 years prosecuting domestic violence cases, looked at her and said, "Thank you. That took extraordinary courage." Bonnie said, "It wasn't courage, it was timing." She didn't explain what she meant. She didn't have to. Cresswell left San Francisco on a Tuesday. No press conference, no public statement, just a car to the airport and a one-way ticket to nobody cared where. The assets were in the process of being transferred. The legal proceedings would continue in his absence. He was, in every meaningful sense, finished, not with violence, not with blood, but with the slow, systematic removal of every structure that had made him feel powerful. Seraphine Lowry, the senator's daughter, gave her own interview 2 weeks later. She didn't name Lawrence. She didn't know Lawrence existed. She simply said that a lawyer had contacted her and asked if she was okay, and that for the first time, she had told someone the truth. The senator issued a statement supporting his daughter. The other 2 women chose privacy. Their identities remained sealed. Their stories remained their own. And that, Lawrence had always understood, was the point. Not every act of justice needs an audience. Some of the most powerful verdicts are delivered in silence. Bonnie moved into the penthouse in February. Not because Lawrence asked, because she chose to. She still worked. She had transferred from Meridian Caulfield's office to a position at a nonprofit legal aid clinic. Downtown, a move Lawrence had facilitated not by pulling strings but by writing a letter of recommendation that Bonnie didn't know about until the clinic's director mentioned it in her interview. She'd confronted him about it afterward, and he'd shrugged and said, "I told the truth. You're the most competent person I've ever met." If that's pulling strings, then every reference letter in history is a puppet show. She'd laughed, a real laugh, the kind that started somewhere deep and came out surprised, like it couldn't believe it was allowed. She was laughing more these days. That night, the night in early spring, with the golden light and the freesias and the fog retreating, Lawrence came home late, not from anything dangerous. In from dinner with an old associate who talked too much about port wine. He found Bonnie on the couch with a book, Dostoevsky's still, her feet tucked under her, the cashmere throw from that first night draped over her lap. She looked up when he walked in, and the way her face changed. Not dramatically, not like a movie, but subtly, like the sun moving behind a cloud and then emerging again, told him everything he needed to know about where they stood. "Hi," she said. "Hi." He hung his coat, poured himself a glass of water instead of whiskey, a change she'd noticed and never commented on, but appreciated in that quiet way she appreciated things. He sat beside her, not close enough to crowd, close enough to feel her warmth. "How was dinner?" she asked. "Endless." Paul Fenwick Osgood spent 40 minutes explaining the difference between Tawny and Ruby Port, and I still don't care. She smiled, set the book down. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything." "That night, in this room, when you found out." She paused, chose her words carefully, the way she always did. "You didn't react the way I expected. I was ready for anger, or pity, or, I don't know, disgust. But you knelt. Why?" Lawrence looked at her, thought about it, not because he didn't know the answer, but because the answer mattered enough to say correctly. "Because," he said, "you had spent years with someone who looked down at you. I wanted the first thing you saw, when the truth was out, to be someone looking up." She stared at him. Her eyes filled. She blinked, and a single tear fell. One, and she wiped it away with a small laugh that was half embarrassment, half something deeper. "You're going to ruin me," she said. "Impossible," he said. "You're unruinable. I've checked." She leaned into him. He put his arm around her, and they sat like that, in the golden light, in the quiet, in the extraordinary ordinariness of a Tuesday night. And something settled between them that was larger than love, though it contained love. It was trust, the kind that isn't built in grand gestures, but in the accumulation of small, daily decisions to be safe for another person. Later that night, they were in the bedroom. The same room, the same bed, the same city lights through the curtains. But this time when the silk came off, she didn't freeze. She stood before him, not hiding, not performing, just present. And she let him see. All of it. In the lines on her back, faded now but still there. The burn scar on her ribs. The places where someone else's hands had left their history. Lawrence looked at her. Not at the marks. At her. He traced a scar along her shoulder blade. Slowly. With the back of his finger. She watched his face, looking for what she always looked for, the flinch, the pity, the moment when someone sees the map of your damage and decides you're too complicated to love. It didn't come. Instead, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to the scar. Gently. The way you touch something sacred. These are not what he did to you, he said against her skin. These are proof that you survived him. She closed her eyes. When she opened them, she was smiling, not the careful, controlled smile she'd worn like armor for years. A real one, wide, unguarded. The smile of a woman who had walked through fire and come out the other side, and discovered that the other side had someone in it who was willing to stand in the ashes with her. No one, Lawrence said, will ever touch you without your permission again. She put her hand against his chest, felt his heart beat. Steady and strong and entirely, completely hers. I know, she said. I know. And in the penthouse above San Francisco, on a night that was no longer cold, two people chose each other. Not because the world was safe, it wasn't, and they both knew it. Not because pain had been erased, it hadn't, and it wouldn't be. But because in the space between what had been and what could be, they had found something rare enough to be worth protecting. Not passion, not power, not even love, though love was there, threaded through everything like the gold veins in dark marble. Safety. The kind of safety that doesn't come from walls or weapons or the ability to destroy your enemies. The kind that comes from being seen, fully, unflinchingly, scars and all, and being held anyway. That was what Lawrence Augustin gave Bonnie Shaw. And in return, she gave him something he hadn't known he was missing. Permission to be gentle.